boldly engaging the mindless propaganda of our time, apparently with reason. This is Rage of the Age.
This is Rage of the Age, and we have with us today the founder and president of End It for Good, a conservative nonprofit advocating a health-centered approach to drugs rather than a criminal justice approach. She has also been featured with a TEDx talk in Jackson, Mississippi. I want to introduce to you today Christina Dent. Christina, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Philip. I'm really excited to be with you and your audience today.
I guess let's just shoot at it from the gate. First, give your background of what led you to this. There's a personal side to what made you go this direction. Let's start there.
Absolutely. So I grew up, born and raised in Mississippi. I've lived here my whole life. I still work out of Mississippi. I grew up in a politically conservative family, wonderful Christian home. Still have both of those sets of values today as a conservative person and as a Christian. I was homeschooled kindergarten through high school by my mom. I attended a Christian university and got a degree in Bible. Never had any interest in drug use all through my growing up, high school, college. I didn't have friends that used drugs. We didn't drink alcohol. It just was not, drugs were not part of my life. And so really my story isn't one of a radically changed lifestyle because I've never used drugs, still illegal drugs. But it's one of a radically changed mind on this issue. So my thoughts about 5 years ago and my whole life before that, I thought about it kind of simply. Drugs are bad. Drug use is bad. Outlawing drugs must be the right things to do. And I never really considered what that meant or, how do you wage a war on drugs? What does that look like played out in the lives of people until we became foster parents. And so through about 4 years of foster care, I started to see that up close in a way that I had never been exposed to before. And through foster care, I met Johann, who was a mother who had been struggling with addiction for quite a few years and was not able to beat her addiction during her pregnancy. So her son had been removed from her custody when he was born, and he was brought to our house, and he became our foster son, this little tiny 5-pound, 9-ounce preemie. And I didn't know anything about addiction at this point. I could not fathom how a mother who loved her son could possibly use drugs while she was pregnant. And so to me, I thought that this must mean she doesn't really love him. Or how could she do that? I'm a mother, and I can't imagine myself doing that. So I took Beckham, her son, to go meet Johann at his first visit with her at the local child welfare office. And I pulled into the parking lot. I had my other 3 boys with me, and we parked, and I popped Beckham's car seat out of the car, and I turned around in the parking lot, and here across the parking lot is sprinting this woman, running with tears streaming down her face. And she runs up to us and she just starts covering Beckham in kisses and talking to him. She doesn't even say hi to me. And I am just standing there awkwardly holding this car seat thinking, what is happening? Like, this is crazy. And I honestly felt really suspicious. This can't be. Moms who love their kids as much as she apparently does don't do things like she did. And so this must be her just putting on a show to try to get me to put in a good word with the social worker. This just does not fit with anything that I thought I knew. And it really was disconcerting, but she had her 1 hour of visit with Beckham, and then she left for inpatient drug treatment, and Beckham came back home with us. And she would call me from treatment, and she would ask me to put her on speakerphone. And she would sing to him over the phone, just his little tiny self. And I just thought, my goodness, this is so vulnerable and so raw in her love for him and her willingness to just show a great deal of vulnerability that I wasn't sure that I could even show given a similar situation. And it really started as I got to know Johann, this war in my heart over what's happening here, because everything I thought I knew about people who use drugs and are struggling with addiction doesn't seem to fit with this situation. I also know that we're putting people like Johann in prison every day. And that seems like in this situation, that would be terrible, because what would that do? Well, it wouldn't help Joanne. She needs help for her addiction, but I don't think prison is going to help that. Drugs are readily available in prison. But it's also going to leave Beckham without a mom. And as a foster parent trained in what happens to children when they experience trauma, I knew that would be devastating for him as he grew up, for their extended family. And it really just started this war in my mind over, what are we doing? Is it working? Could we be doing something different? And I went on a journey to learn.
So, at what point then did you take that experience and then become a founder of an organization to try to intervene?
Yeah, so I started the journey to learn. The journey to learn took me about 2 years of kind of, it would come kind of in and out of my sights as like the most important thing I wanted to know about. But it took a long time because I was trying to rebuild a different framework, because the framework I had been using of drugs are bad, drug use is bad, outlawing them is the right thing to do, and criminalizing people for it just wasn't working. So I tried to kind of get my head above the trees and say, why am I supporting prohibition? Like, what's my ultimate goal? And what I came to as my North Star is that, well, I support that because I think drugs are bad. Well, why do I think they're bad? Well, because they cause devastation in a lot of people's lives. So really my goal is decreasing harm. I want to reduce harm to people. So as a Christian who believes that people are made in the image of God, and someone who's pro-life, that's important to me, that we are reducing harm to people or preventing harm to people if we can do that. And what I learned on that journey, and what ultimately led to my founding In It for Good, was that when we talk about drug harms, we're actually talking about two different kinds of harm. So there's the kind of harm that can come from, putting substances in your body, but there's also the kind of harm that comes from our drug laws. And I realized that the more and more I learned, and the more I kind of categorized the different sorts of harm that we have related to drugs, the more I think that the vast majority of harm that we see in our world today is actually coming from criminalizing drugs, not from the substances themselves. Let me give you 3 ways I think that happens. So when you criminalize drugs, you change the market for the substance, you change the substance itself, and you change what happens to consumers. So the market goes from law-abiding business people in charge of it to a criminal underground. We saw that during alcohol prohibition. We're seeing it today during the prohibition of other drugs. So today, worldwide, globally, the illegal drug market is worth $500 billion per year. Now, that's how much money consumers want to spend on illegal drugs. And the only people who can make any of that money are people who are willing to break the law and oftentimes be very violent, because that's the only way you can protect your territory. So if we look at just what's happening in Mexico, Mexican cartels make $20 billion a year just off of U.S. drug sales. I had an interesting experience last summer. I'm working on a book, and I was interviewing a guy, Ismail, and his mom grew up in Colombia during the time when cocaine, that was the main kind of route for cocaine. And as we're talking on the interview over Zoom, he leans forward and he says, actually, the necklace that I'm wearing was the necklace my mom wore as a child when she was growing up. It's a little gold charm that's in the shape of the country of Colombia. And he flips it over and he says, look, on the back of it is her blood type. The violence was so bad from the cartels because of the illegal drug trade there that the government encouraged citizens to have their blood type on their body somewhere, either to have it tattooed or on a charm or something like that. So as a girl, she grew up wearing this necklace, not because her family was involved in the drug trade, but because the violence of an underground market was so great there that regular civilians were caught up in it all the time in crossfire. So we're not really fighting crime by drug prohibition. We're really funding it and fueling, kind of handing this huge industry over to it, and not allowing it to operate in kind of a legal, regulated way. So we see this market transfer happen. We see what happens to a substance when you prohibit it. So during alcohol prohibition, we went from having legal, regulated alcohol to, whatever people are making in their bathtubs or the backwoods. And the same things happen today with other drugs. We have, instead of legal regulated substances where people know what's in the substance that they're buying, We have contaminated drugs on the street that are a lot more potent because you need a bigger punch in a smaller package when you have to smuggle it. But also they're really contaminated. And I think when you look at what's happening with the opioid overdose crisis right now, people tend to be most familiar with that. If you look at what's actually in people's bodies when they die, 83% of opioid overdoses now, the person has either heroin or fentanyl in their system. So we're not seeing people dying from legal prescriptions that they got legally of regulated drugs. There are a few people dying from that, but the vast majority of people are dying from unregulated drugs that they're buying on the street. And I kind of see that as, our choice is, do we want people who are struggling with addiction, maybe can't stop, and got cut off of, their pain pills or whatever they were getting? Do we want them under the care of a doctor, or do we want them under the care of a drug dealer? And so what we're doing right now is we're not decreasing overdose deaths through prohibition. We're actually increasing them because the harder and harder that we make for people to access any form of regulated substance, the more and more market share we give to the underground market, where people are going to the street and buying things that are really, really dangerous and potent. They don't know if it's going to get them high or kill them because there's no regulation surrounding it. So that's that substance transfer that happens. And the last part is what happens to consumers when you criminalize a substance. So during alcohol prohibition, and we kind of generally have a knowledge in America that didn't go very well. There were a few people who didn't drink anymore, but we had a lot of all of this kind of collateral damage. We had a lot of crime related to it and contamination. But during alcohol prohibition, we actually never criminalized consumers. So you were allowed to drink alcohol. You could produce it for yourself and drink it in your own home. You were never arrested for that. If a speakeasy got busted, the people who were there drinking did not get arrested. It was just the people who were selling. So we have kind of added this third category of harm to our current criminalization of drugs by criminalizing the consumers who are using them. So today, if we look at how many people are using illegal drugs in America, 1 in 10 have used an illegal drug recently, if you look at adult Americans. And that's not a number from like a reform organization. That's the Office of National Drug Control Policy, which is kind of like the drugs are of the United States. They say 1 in 10 Americans has used an illegal drug recently. If you look at incarceration worldwide, 1 in 5 people who are incarcerated are there on a drug offense. Over 80% of those are just for drug possession. So we kind of immediately, I think, assume that must be a bunch of, people from cartels and gangs and people doing violent things. The vast majority of people in jail or prison for a drug offense, it is for possession only. I saw this kind of in play a couple of years ago after I had changed my mind, but before I had started End It for Good, I had gone to court to support a friend that had a court hearing. Well, when you go to a court hearing, you get to hear the other cases that are called before that case because they run through them pretty quickly, and so you just have to sit through the other cases. So we were hearing cases about all sorts of different things, and one of them was a young man who's probably, I don't know, early 20s. And he was brought in, and he had been in jail for about 4 months. And he was there for a first-time drug possession offense. And he was in jail because he couldn't afford the bail amount that had been set for him. And so he'd never been in trouble with the law before. This was his first interaction with the criminal justice system, but here he has been here for 4 months just because he couldn't afford bail. And so he had a really unique name. So I thought, I wonder if I can find this guy. So I went home and I looked him up on social media. Sure enough, there he was. And so, I'm looking, it takes me about 3 seconds to realize he has a wife. He has a toddler age daughter at home. And, we don't really think about, I kind of think we're arresting sort of the worst of the worst. And here's a guy who, according to his social media, is employed. He's got a wife and family. Clearly has some sort of drug problem. Maybe he's addicted. Maybe he was experimenting. But who are we helping by incarcerating him maybe he's the primary breadwinner of the family. What is that doing to families if we want strong families, if we want to really help people? And if he's addicted, he can readily get the drugs in prison as well, in jail. That's common experience for people. So I see it as, for consumers especially, and this is really the piece that where Joann kind of got me interested in this. I ended up becoming convinced on more things as I got into it. But that it really starts this vicious cycle for most people who are consuming drugs. There are a few people that say jail was the best thing that ever happened to me. For the vast majority of them, it is part of a really destructive cycle. So you kind of start with the drug use, you introduce incarceration, which disconnects people from their family and community, which is one of the main things that can help people overcome an addiction, is to reclaim those connections. I love the episode you did with Ed Cressy. He says, booze and drugs aren't our problem. They're a solution attempt at our problem. And, connection is really what we need, not this disconnection. So we have the disconnection of incarceration. People come out, they have employment difficulty because they have a criminal record now. That whole cycle is really traumatic. And now we didn't know this 50 years ago, but we do know now that trauma is one of the highest risk factors for drug experimentation in the first place, and for experimentation to develop into addiction. So it's almost like we're using the worst possible thing to try to address a problem that's made worse. We're using trauma to try to address a problem that's made worse by trauma. So we're not starving addiction by criminalizing people for it. We're really feeding those addictions. So that is what ended up changing my mind. That process of learning what happens when you criminalize a market, what happens when you criminalize a consumer, what happens when you criminalize a substance. And I started kind of looking at that all and saying, we're losing on every front. We're signaling that we don't want people using drugs, but the outcome of that signaling is actually an incredible amount of human cost. And that's what ended up changing my mind and leading me to start End It for Good, as I began to see, I really think the world would be a different place if we didn't have all of these harms from prohibition, and we could focus all of our resources on addressing the harms from substance use itself.
Let me come in your direction toward the center at a spot where we can tango a little bit here. I'll start with agreeing with many of the premises you've written in your blogs and some of the things you've mentioned now, that the current system we have in the justice system of dealing with the drug issue is obviously failing. I don't think anyone is at that realm to where they say, yep, it's good as it is, leave it alone. I think we all know there's something wrong with how we process, not just with drugs, but like so many issues that the courts are involved in. Just in family court alone, I've sat through many of those, and the cases I've heard are like, I'm thinking, what in the world is this accomplishing?
Right.
But nonetheless, the way the criminal justice system has worked, obviously, it's defunct, and something needs to be done. I think we understand that there is a level of addiction for drugs, and that there's more needed than isolating them, putting them in a cell where they push the drugs in the prison anyway. And we think, well, that's obviously not going to help the person there. We think maybe they can go to rehab and they can do some things. I've known numerous people to go to rehabs and go through different programs, and it still fell for them too, though. And they go right back to the drugs again. I don't know if we fully understand the exact what to do on a lot of levels, but we know something's wrong. I guess maybe what a lot of people may have in fears of hearing what you're saying, and you can address these, is are you saying legalize drugs totally? Are we going to pay to give them their drugs? Or can you just possess them whenever you want? If a family has drugs and use drugs, is it okay for them to share it with their kids? Like I've seen personally happen. Does the law pull them out of that family, or do they have to leave them because we don't want to break up the family? There's so, and my wife has done social work for a while. She's told me so many horrible stories of walking into these families that are very dysfunctional. And there's times where we wonder why the law didn't do some things because of the issue of the child with the parent. And I'm thinking, I don't know what the problem is with the parent, good or bad, if we can fix it or not, but there's no way that child should have to live like that with that parent. There's a lot of moving factors around here. Um, what is it that you want to see that you think is achievable?
Yeah. Those are all great questions, and all questions I think everybody has who is beginning to think about this issue. And I'm never afraid of the questions because I think that's how we get to good places, is if we're not afraid to ask hard questions. So what I came to is, as I looked about what's happening, why is it happening, what could be better. I ended up changing my mind in favor of some form of legal regulation for all drugs. Like I can't see a way that prohibition helps. It doesn't fix everything to legalize, but prohibition doesn't fix it either and introduces all these other harms with the market and substance and what happens to consumers. And so, there's a continuum of options. Some people would say we just need to decriminalize possession. People shouldn't be put in jail for just possessing a substance, but, we shouldn't legalize the market. And I would say, well, that's great. I definitely agree with decriminalization of possession. But that doesn't fix the crime problem. And the vast majority of all crime and is caused by drug prohibition today. It also funds terrorist organizations who are primarily funded through drug prohibition, also through participating in the illegal drug trade. So for me, it was a really hard place to come to. Like, this is the place I didn't want to end up at. I used to hear people talk about legalizing even marijuana. And I was like, that is so insane. Why do we want to live in a world like that? That's just terrible. And now I look at it more as what we're doing is weighing cost and benefit. There's no world where drugs go away. There's no world where we have no harm from them. So I'm weighing which way could we handle them that causes the least amount of harm. And that's what has convinced me that legalization is the way to go. Now, how you do that is different for different substances. We have different regulatory methods for alcohol versus smoking versus opioids, or tobacco versus opioids. And the same thing would be true of other substances. If there's more potential for harm, we might have tighter regulations around that. If there's less potential for harm, we could have looser regulations around it. But there's no drug that is made safer by prohibiting it. And I think that what people like me, maybe who don't have an experience with drug use, might think is, if we don't see it, it's not there. Surely there's no heroin in my community. Surely, but the reality is that any drug is
It's
available
everywhere.
in any community to anyone who
Mhm.
wants to find it. I don't see heroin because I'm not looking for it. But
Right.
the minute I was looking for it, I would easily find it. I would just find it a very contaminated substance. I would be buying it from people selling it on the street corner. And as a mother who's looking to protect my kids from the harms of substance addiction, I would rather substances be behind a counter, regulated, with age restrictions getting it, than just on a street corner where you can buy it if you're 14, you can buy it if you're 34. It's all the same. You're just a consumer to them. So our kids, I think about for our kids, it is safer for them that we legally regulate substances rather than leaving them, out on the street corner. I was talking to a guy a couple of weeks ago who is a head chef at a popular restaurant here in Jackson. And he said, when I was in high school, my friends and I used to smoke marijuana all afternoon while we would drive around to different people's houses trying to find somebody that could buy alcohol for us. Because marijuana was everywhere and it was easy to get. Alcohol, you at least had to know somebody's brother who was over 21, or you had to know, exactly which store might sell it to you, but there weren't many of those because they were afraid of losing their license to sell to adults if they were caught selling to underage teenagers. So what an interesting thing. That's something I would have never thought about. I would have thought marijuana is harder to get because it's banned. And in reality, it just puts it out on the street where everyone is an equal consumer and everyone is buying it from the underground market. So I think you bring up some great points with child welfare, with what do we do with families. This is what I think is one of the hardest things about substance use, is acknowledging that we can't stop all harm from substance use. And just like with alcohol. So we don't arrest parents just because they drink alcohol. You're allowed to drink it. What we do there is we say, is the alcohol use causing harm to the children? Not just, are you drinking alcohol? And a lot of what we do now is we say, are you using any illegal drug? Well, you must automatically be, a terrible parent. And in reality, there's a lot of parents who non-problematically use drugs, just like there are lots of parents who non-problematically use the drug of alcohol. But there are some where addiction is present and where the children aren't safe. There might be some where there's an addiction. This is true of alcohol also. And yet the children don't need to be removed from the home. Maybe there's other ways to mitigate that harm. Maybe there's other ways that one parent could go to treatment and the other one is home with the kids or whatever it might be. But nowhere do I want people to hear, we need to end the criminalization of drugs and we don't care what people do related to drugs. Like as with alcohol, you can't drive drunk. We're still going to arrest you. You can't go, right. You can't go beat somebody up. And we say, well, gosh, you were drunk. We can't do anything about that. We say, no, we have laws against beating people up. We have laws against driving while you're drunk. We have laws against harming your kids and neglecting or abusing them. All of those same laws would still be in play with other drugs. So that it is not a free for all. I see it more as prohibition really creates the free for all. It's these unknown people selling unknown substances to unknown consumers in the dark. It's surrounded by death and crime and disease. And I think legal regulation actually brings that back into some order. As somebody who, grew up and still supports of, lots of people that want law and order. I think this is actually a better way to get law and order than the free for all of the underground market. But it is important that people realize it is not saying that people can just do whatever they want to without accountability. Even if you, let's say, addiction seeking behavior like theft, a lot of property crime, about 8 out of 10 property crimes are committed by people who are engaging in criminal activity to get money to buy drugs because they have an addiction. We're not saying, well, that's okay. They've got an addiction. They can do whatever they want. Nope. You're still going to be arrested for theft, just like you would if you stole somebody's lawnmower and you weren't trying to get money for drugs or you weren't high or whatever. All those same laws still apply. This is really just about, should we handle drugs in a legal regulated way or continue to allow them to be in the free for all of the underground market? What should we do with consumers who want to consume those drugs? Should they have the ability to make that choice for themselves? And we try to mitigate the harms to other people of that. And I think we would actually see less harm to other people without the stigmatization of being labeled a criminal. So it's very difficult to admit that you are a criminal. And that's kind of what we're asking people to do who are struggling with an addiction or use of an illegal substance, is we're saying, if you're going to come forward about this, if you're going to access treatment, you're admitting to criminal activity. You are a criminal. That's how we've labeled you. I think that makes it really, really difficult for people to access treatment when they need it, because none of us want that kind of labeling. But those are good questions.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
There's no free-for-all like you're saying, because I think when a lot of people hear we should legalize drugs, they're picturing everything you just...
Right.
Just do whatever you want. And I guess what you're trying to say is there's still regulation, there's still laws. You'll still go to jail over certain things.
Absolutely.
I guess I'm thinking of like tobacco use. You have to be over 18 to buy it. If you sell it to a minor, there's still... I ain't seen nobody go to jail over it yet, but I imagine there's fees or whatever for breaking that to the store owner or whatnot. there's still some regulation.
Mm-hmm.
They're still answering to the law with some things. I guess that's an important thing to make sure is noted, that not asking for just light up, do what you want,
Right.
inject it, do whatever, no consequences. There's still consequences.
Absolutely.
To I guess the other thing in people's minds would be, though, if it's the addictions are driving them to do the uh, risky behaviors. I don't know which came first, but they seem to be tied together. The risky behaviors, uh, the theft and the crime to support a habit. If that is legalized, they still have the habit. They still have to support it. Will that make them stop their theft and stealing your lawnmower, or is that going to go away?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways that can be dealt with. So one of the ways that we already have here in the US is through drug courts. So drug courts, I think, are a great way to deal with some of those drug-seeking behaviors that were crimes they need to be held accountable for. And
Mhm.
yet, when a judge realizes if we don't deal with your addiction, you're going to be
Mhm.
out there tomorrow stealing somebody else's lawnmower because you've still got the addiction. So
Right.
drug courts are a great way that people can have accountability for crimes that they committed because of their addiction, while also being able to get help for that addiction. And I think that's a great innovation in the court system to recognize, okay, we could just go put you in jail for a few months and
Mhm.
put you back out on the street, but that's actually not really helping you or the community if we don't give you a chance to deal with the things that are underneath. Is
What does a drug court do that a regular court don't do?
So drug courts allow for a person to generally how they work is the person lives at home. They check in, they drug test weekly. They have to go to court every couple of weeks. They're part of kind of this cohort of people that are all going through drug court together, and so they're able to stay abstinent. Most drug courts require abstinence, or you can be on medication assisted treatment for an addiction. Um,
Mm.
and so it provides accountability. Usually they're multi-year. Here in Mississippi, I think generally that's a 3-year program that you have to be abstinent, testing, coming to all of these meetings. Most of them require that you go to some 12-step meetings as part of it. They kind of develop a plan for what is this going to look like for you? Do you want to go to inpatient treatment? Do you want to do outpatient treatment? And if you can complete and graduate from the program, then you will not have to go to jail for the charges you were originally arrested for. So it's a way of providing accountability in a
Mhm.
way that can actually help you and the community much more, because the community is going to be far better off with
Mhm.
you sober and not stealing lawnmowers anymore than they are with you spending a few months in jail, back out stealing
Right.
lawnmowers again.
But there's still a criminal justice bite to it, though.
There is, and I think that to me is an appropriate response to crimes that hurt other people. You took somebody else's whatever it was, and but while still allowing for the person to address the real deeper cause of why they did that. So I see it as more kind of thoughtful rather than just reactionary. Like we can keep doing the reactionary thing, but it just doesn't work if you actually want to see, less crime in your community. You really need to address those underlying issues. So when you think about, you know, prohibition, I think there's for a lot of people, this signaling piece is a really big thing. Like we want to signal to people that we don't want them using drugs. And when you make drugs illegal, it's a pretty big signal that you don't approve of drug use. And I would say yes. And there's a part of me that just wishes that that would work. But if you look at how many people are using drugs, 1 in 10, illegal drugs, it hasn't stopped the vast majority of people who want to use drugs from using them. And the price is really, really high in terms of human life. We've got tens of thousands of people dying of overdoses from contaminated drugs every year that don't have to die. Those are preventable overdoses if they could access something that was not contaminated. You have tens of thousands of people dying in gang, cartel, drug related violence every year. Those are people that don't have to die. We don't have that in the alcohol industry. People aren't dying over alcohol deals gone bad. And we don't have these tens of thousands of people that are in our prisons And that has a real effect on family structure. So for somebody like me who is conservative, who's pro-life, who wants to see strong families, who wants to see safe communities, I think prohibition is actually a massive factor working against the things that we want to see in stable families and lower crime and safer communities, in productive citizens that are able to provide for their own families. Here in Mississippi, it is 1 in 13 adults has a felony on their record. Now, those aren't all drug related, but we are just killing our workforce, not just here in Mississippi, but across the United States. We've got so many people with criminal records. And then the thing that we want, which is for them to be a contributing member of society and to raise your kids and, help us continue to have a great country, we're actively working against that, with all the ways that we're criminalizing, and often in people's younger years, but it follows them for the rest of their life.
Right.
So that signaling, that the two questions I would ask there are, does the signaling work? It does work, I think, for a few people, but not for the vast majority. It hasn't worked in keeping people from using drugs. And what is the price we're willing to pay to signal? And for me, the human life cost of that signaling, I can't justify in my own conscience. I just can't justify that amount of loss of life from all the different ways that life is lost through prohibition. And I'm okay, even though I don't want people using drugs. I don't want my own kids using drugs. I'm okay allowing people to make that choice because of how much I think we would gain. I think for every 1 unit of positive that we get from prohibition, like there's a few people that don't use drugs, I think there's 10 units of harm that come from it, from all of those extra harms that come. So I see that as the weighing of cost versus benefit. I'll still teach my kids the potential for harm from drugs. I hope that they don't use them. But I'm okay with them seeing drugs sold like alcohol and tobacco are sold, or like a prescription opioid is sold, and taking that responsibility on myself to teach them about the harms of those, to be able to prevent the loss of life of tens of thousands of people every year. To me, that's a trade that I can make, with a good, clear conscience.
End It for Good, the organization that you founded. What is it that you do?
We do what we're doing right now, which is inviting people to consider things they may not have considered before. We're clear about kind of where we've landed, as we think this is the best way forward. But really, our mission as an organization is just to invite people to consider approaches to drugs that will prioritize life and the opportunity for people to thrive. And people can come to different conclusions about what they think that is, but we want to encourage more people to think about what their North Star is. What do they really want? Prohibition is just a means. It's a tool. What is the end that we really want? For me, it is reducing harm to people. For you, it might be something different. But what is our goal? And then what are the kinds of policies that get us closer to that goal? And for me, I had not rethought my position on the drug war ever. I'd never really thought about it, to be honest with you. And that's probably the response that I hear most from people is, I've never really thought about this before. I just assumed what we were doing was the best thing to do. It seemed like drugs are bad, drug use is bad, so let's make them outlawed, and that'll be the best way we can fix our problems. And that's what we want to invite people to do, is to take the time to lean in, to learn before you make up your mind. The futures of people like Joanne and Beckham do hang in the balance. So just open the door. Don't jump to conclusions. Do some research. Don't change your mind just because I think you should. You have your own intellect and you can make your own decisions. But for me, the decision that I made for my whole life up until about 5 years ago was made on a misunderstanding of where the cause and effect of harm is coming from. So my values have not changed over the course of my changing my mind. I still have the same values as a Christian. I still have the same values as someone who's conservative, but I have changed how I think the best way to live out those values is. I thought drugs were causing all of this harm. I thought drugs were causing the crime. Drugs are causing the overdoses. And I did not recognize and understand the forces of prohibition that are driving a lot of those things. And so for me, as I learned about that, um, I realized that I saw my values best expressed through a legal regulated approach to drugs rather than a criminal justice approach to drugs. And that's what we invite people to consider. I'll tell you about Nikki, who is another mom. Actually, so her situation and Joanne's happened about the same time. She was also a mom who struggled with addiction. She relapsed halfway through her pregnancy. And her son was also removed to foster care because of her prenatal drug use. He was fostered by some friends of ours. But Nikki was, she relapsed on prescription drugs rather than drugs off the street like Joanne. And so her drug use popped up on a prescription drug monitoring program. And she was arrested for it and prosecuted for child abuse for using prescription drugs while she was pregnant in a way she wasn't supposed to. And she is about 2 years into a 15-year prison sentence in North Mississippi for that relapse during her pregnancy. So you have two women that are the same age. They're both white women in their 30s, similar situations, and yet very different approaches, very different responses to the struggles that they had during their pregnancies. So Joanne today is doing great. She's been sober for 5 years now. She was sober just about from the time that her son was born onwards. And she works now at the treatment center that she was able to find sobriety at and does their intake for new patients. So it doesn't always happen like that. Like you said, you see this where people have an opportunity to go to treatment and they relapse and they start using again. Sometimes that can happen over and over and over again. And it's absolutely maddening and so frustrating, beyond frustrating for
Yes.
families that are dealing with it. I mean, you just want to scream and pull your hair out. So it doesn't always happen like it did for Joanne. And I think that's true with other kinds of addictions. That's true of alcohol addictions, true of gambling addiction, true of all of these other ways. They are devastating to families. And yet we don't put people in jail for an alcohol addiction unless they break other laws and hurt other people. We don't put people in jail for a gambling addiction unless they're breaking some other law and, hurting other people in some sort of way. So we have responded to Nikki in a way that doesn't deal with the relapse and has devastated her family. Her children are growing up without her. Her mom is raising her kids while she's in prison. Her mom is working 2 jobs to try to support herself and the kids and Nikki while she's in prison. When I asked her mom whether or not I could use their story as I talk about these issues, the first words out of her mom's mouth were, "Thank you for not forgetting us." And that's what I want people to consider, because the way that we handle people like Joanne and Nikki, there are millions of people like them every year just in the US, is our responsibility as voters, as citizens. They are responsible for their drug use, but we are responsible for the kinds of laws that affect what happens related to their drug use. And so I see myself as kind of one of the judges there, because whatever I'm supporting is part of what is creating a response for people like Joanne and Nikki. So it was the desires and sentiments and votes of people just like me who have created the laws that we have. And it's people just like you and me who can lead us out of it if that's what we want. And that's what we want people to consider is there a better way? What better way do we want to support? We might differ on what we think the best thing to do is. And then how do we actually make that happen? Because people like Nikki are cycling through our court system every single day, and we are loading people into prison. And we don't see that. We don't have to face that as just citizens who are going around, picking our groceries up at Walmart and going to church on Sundays and whatever else we do. But it is happening all around us, and it is a response to what our laws are doing. And if we want something different for people like Nikki, then we have to be willing to learn, to lean in, and to say, do I want to be part of something else?
Christina, you definitely bring up some things to think about. Like I said, I believe most people would agree that as things are now, it's just not working. And we want something better. There's definitely going to be variations on how things are viewed, but it's something we need to basically start talking about and reforming a lot of the things in which we're doing. And I thank you for being a guest on this program to talk about that today.
Absolutely. Thank you. If anybody wants more information or wants to kind of take the journey with us, they can go to enditforgood.com/get started. There's a couple of different resources there for whether you want to put just a little bit of time into it or more time into it. Also linked on our enditforgood.com homepage is the TEDx talk that I did that you mentioned earlier. It includes a lot of the same things that we've been talking about today. So if people just want to revisit that or send it to a friend and say, what do you think about this? Is this nuts? Or should we be thinking about this more? You could do that. And if you're listening and you think, yes, this is what I want to see happen, you can join us. There's a weekly newsletter we send out for other people that just want to encourage more people to have this conversation called 2 Minutes for Good. You can sign up for that also on our website, and you will find our tone the same as what you've heard today. We are not interested in angry protesting. I just don't think that would not have helped me. And I'm glad that there were people along my journey that were able to have just civil, respectful conversations with me, addressing all of the questions and concerns that I had. And that's what we want to provide for people. We're across social media at End It For Good MS. And I also do a lot of writing on social media on a lot of the things we've talked about. And you can find me at Christina B. Dent.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
Welcome to the essay segment. As I was listening along through the interview with Christina, a thought had entered my head that there might be a certain reaction in some of the listeners that you would probably ask the question, Phil, why in the world did you have someone with an opinion like that on your show? And the reason is because honestly, I was just curious and wanted to hear it. I wanted to see how that conclusion was reached to. And I've said this before, and I really want to emphasize this again. This program that I do is meant to be one of free discussion and to actually consider ideas and to look at the merit of something for what it really is. To me, that is the conservative position. The last thing I would want to become is like a big tech company or a big media company that just wants to suppress any opposition to anything I currently think at the time. That is what I am absolutely not for. And though I don't fully agree with maybe some of the extents that Christina would probably want to go to, there are some things that I do agree with. And that is something we need to truly consider in light of this subject. Drugs are a big problem in this country. And for some reason, the powers that be and those in government act like there's no problem going on. No, the biggest concerns is whether I can tell the difference between a boy and a girl right now, or if a man could go into a girl's bathroom or play women's sports. Apparently, things like this are like of such utmost importance to our country. It's almost an insult to the lives of the average Americans in this country that our elites think that's more important than other issues, such as the drug trade. I really believe there is not one family in this country that has not been impacted by drug use, either directly or indirectly. Probably every family knows someone that has overdosed, a friend or a family, a neighbor. And in some families, it is of a far greater number than others, depending on location and the familiarity of drug use within the circles that you keep. And besides the overdose and the deaths from that, there's the other effects that take place where lives are literally ruined, utterly destroyed, and they take people with them. It's not just the one who uses the drugs, it's the families. They are hurt by it just the same, and they're being crushed by it. But why is this not being addressed on a national level? Because the big tech And the big media and the powers that be who control what you hear don't care. This isn't a problem to them. They have other pet projects that are just far more important. And apparently, this topic doesn't draw enough blood or something. I don't know. But it's just not on their radar. They don't care. But this is a big deal of what's going on in this country right now. And yet none of our leaders seem to care. I am convinced of this, though. With Christina, some of the things she says does make some sense. And that is why we need open discussion in this country again, to actually hear what others are saying. And then we are free to choose whether we agree or not. To me, that is the true conservative American position. And that is how I'll always be about it. And again, I don't agree with to the full extent of maybe what she's thinking of. But I do agree with this. What is the point of sending someone to 15 years in jail for using drugs? Did that benefit society at all? Did that fix the person? It punished them, I'm sure, but was there to what cost? I mean, we have to feed and house these people for as long as we keep them in jail. And let's be honest, society don't get back nothing from them while they're in jail. Though I would be in favor of making prisoners work for their keep, apparently that's bad. Apparently that's, mistreatment. I don't know. We get nothing back out of putting people in jail. They just sit there, and we pay to have them sit there. And it's expensive. Now, if we have an overwhelming number of people in our prison systems who are there just because they use drugs, we're paying for that. And that cost is huge. And they're just sitting there. They're of no good to society. More than likely, a bunch of them in that setting are not going to reform. And they'll get out again and go right back to where they started, into using drugs. So what have we accomplished in that process? Nothing. Just sending these people to jail might make us feel good that, yeah, we're going to punish you for your stupidity. But in the end, we still pay for it. So society suffers by that approach. It don't help none. And it definitely doesn't erase the crime. Now, does it? Now, one thing I'm sure of is I'm not very sympathetic to the drug dealer. They're the ones who are literally killing people to sell this stuff. They're the ones who are trying to addict people to it by any means. They're very underhanded by it. I have sympathy for most addicts. I really do, because they were pulled into this thing through one means or another. But I have no sympathy for the one who pushed it on them in the first place, because you are addicting them, and it'll probably cost them their life, but hey, you made an extra buck on the side. I don't respect that at all. Not one bit. To legalize that aspect would just absolutely infuriate me. But I do feel for the addict. They're put in the corners, and the only way they know how to cope with these issues is to turn to these drugs. And it's a self-perpetuating cycle. And breaking it is not going to happen in a jail. Admittedly, sometimes it doesn't even happen in a rehab. I don't know if we fully understand how it works yet. But there's a lot to it. But I know I have known people who have been through this horrendous cycle of drugs. And they've come out on the other side to the positive. And they're living better lives. They're living productive lives. And they like who they are now compared to who they were with the drugs. And that would not have happened if they were just thrown into a jail cell that we would have to pay for and simply maintain. Now, is legalization going to fix the drug problem? I'm not convinced of that fully. But I do know we need to revamp some of how we view the laws and punishing people who just simply have drugs and use them. That's a good start that we can begin with. And we just need to admit as a community that's a problem. And we have to admit that those who are suffering from it, they need a certain touch that they're not getting. They don't have a sense of community. You know where they find that sense of community? With others who do drugs just like them. That's their sense of community. They don't feel like they can really blend in somewhere else. They feel isolated. That isolation really affects you. It really does. We need our communities back, and we need our families back. Now, it's definitely not going to happen with people thrown in jail. But also, we just need to regain that sense of community again, that sense of family. This country has been on a war against the idea of family for a very long time, and I think we're really paying the price because of it. Now, will legalization fix all this? Again, I'm not sure. I don't really believe it, because you're still going to have a street value to things. And when you think about, to me, the biggest sell is that if this could totally defund terrorist organizations, on that alone, I would really seriously consider it. But I'm not convinced that that would suddenly dry up their money. I was just thinking, if I was the terrorist organization, or if I was the drug cartel, how would I adopt to legalization to where they were trying to cut me out through the legalization process? And to me, the answer is simple. You just get stuck into the supply chain somewhere. And you create fronts of companies that are legit now, and you hide behind them. And I'm not even in that trade. And to me, that was the obvious move. Look, they're not just going to give up and go, oh, they cut me out. I guess I can't sell drugs anymore. They're still going to have an in somewhere. And for a lot of us, we don't understand that they control the source of production in a lot of places. It's still going to come from them, and they're going to make sure that they get their cut. But if we legalize it, what's to stop them from becoming legal? If they're legit, they're still selling their drugs. They're still making the money. There's a lot of problems to that. Now you can't prosecute them at all. If they're legal, now you can't stop them at all. Unless you can tie some kind of tie to terrorism, but apparently that's not easy. It's just not. The reality is this. We have drug laws now, prohibition in place for drugs, but I really don't see it being prosecuted. So in my mind, we have a declared war that we refuse to fight for whatever reasons. I live in an area where everyone knows drug deals are going on all around us. The police know even that drug deals are going on all around us, but I don't hear of anybody getting busted. I don't hear of these major drug raids. I don't hear of any pushers going down. Why? We're not prosecuting it. For whatever reason, either we don't care, or we don't think it's worth it, or the judge keeps throwing them out anyway. There's obviously something broke in the approach of just fighting it. We're not even trying to fight it anymore. And if we're not going to fight it, let's at least admit it and try something new. But fully legalizing it, I don't know if I'm on board with that. How do you regulate cocaine? Would that make cocaine use go down if you regulate it? That's pretty addictive stuff. Alcohol's addictive, but man, nothing compared to like cocaine and heroin, things like that. Am I willing to see stores just sell cocaine? Would they sell crack? Crystal meth, would that be an acceptable, approved drug? And if it is, are you going to sell it to people who are under 21? Which means you're going to have somewhere a restriction that someone could work. Most of the people that get sucked in the drugs comes from 21 and younger, I would imagine. So if you still make it illegal for them, you've still made a street value for those young kids to get involved. And look, they'll go sell it at the school. They'll gladly hook them on it. And then what's that kid going to do? The exact same crimes to try to support their habit for now a legalized substance that would hopefully curb it. I'm not convinced on so many levels about a full legalization, but I am willing to already start with the fact that throwing in a bunch of people addicted to drugs that honestly was pushed on them by the true evil perpetrators who don't even get punished half the time, that's where I'm upset. My government wants to argue about men using women's bathrooms and like that's some kind of right, when on our streets and in our communities every day there are people who are being abused through their addictions so that someone else could be making money on the side because they won't earn it honestly. And they're not getting caught and they're not being punished. But then these people who have the drugs on them get thrown in jail and get put in these programs, and they pay the price for it. And it's utterly maddening. And it's definitely not justice, that's for sure. So what is the answer? I don't know. And that's what maybe we just have to start there and just admit we really don't know what the answer is right now. But I know what we're doing isn't working. I know that people's lives are being ruined constantly. And as far as what the government can do, who knows? Who knows? But I'm a simple man with a simple faith. And I believe that in Jesus Christ, we all can be made a new creation in Christ. And I'm reminded of the program called Teen Challenge, which was helped really spearheaded by a very, very Christian man, David Wilkerson, back in the day, who went to the drug areas in New York City and just wanted to bring them Jesus Christ. And a lot of them, as a result, had left their addictions behind. And that program that he had started so long ago is very successful. I believe last heard is like a 90% success rate. And you want to know what the big element to that is that most rehab places don't have? It's called Jesus. There are locations in the world that don't like Christians, but they want that entity, Teen Challenge, to come there to help combat their drug problem. And they're willing to overlook the fact that Jesus is involved because the drug problem is that bad. And I don't want to sound corny, but I guess I'm just going to. Sometimes we forget that the answer for a lot of our problems is in Jesus. What's the answer? Jesus. What's the answer for all of man's sin? It's Jesus. I mean, I know I sound like a big simpleton, but what else do you have? Do you have a better solution? There isn't no system you can't make that some sinful man's not going to work around and profit off of, because we're just that deplorable in our sin. But when we are made new creations in Jesus Christ, that is when lives turn around. That is when attitudes change. That is when there is a spirit in us that doesn't come from us. It comes from God, and it does a work in us. And I believe Jesus can do far more work in people's lives with their drugs than any program we can dream up, than any law we can pass, than any type of judicial process. That's just handling effects. But if you want to get to the root cause, it's that sin that is within us. And the place where that can be dealt with directly is with Jesus.
You've been listening to Rage of the Age. If you loved today's podcast, make sure to leave a review on the media you're listening through. Secure future episodes by heading over to rageoftheage.com and clicking the RSS feed button. Until next time, this has been Rage of the Age.